Hello, welcome to my channel Nomad's Land Studios. My name is Rebecca, and today I will be reading for you an original story from the r/nosleep subreddit entitled Babes in the Wood by Reddit user E.G.Writings. The rain was beating down through the night with dominant force. The officers had nothing to guide them through the trees but their flashlights and the haunting idea of a young girl left alone in the woods on a cold and rainy night. So they marched on. It had been hours since they received the call from a distraught Mrs. Winthrop saying something horrible must have happened to her daughter, Wendy. She could offer very little insight about what could have happened or where, and was barely calm enough to tell her story to the dispatcher over the phone. Mrs. Winthrop said she had picked up her children from school and had begun preparing dinner. That had been when Wendy pecked her on the cheek, saying she was going exploring and would be back before supper. Mrs. Winthrop explained this was a regular occurrence because her daughter loved exploring the woods behind their house. She would pack a backpack, grab her trusty blue rain jacket, and head out with a large stick that she would use for walking. Mrs. Winthrop said her daughter had a knack for showing up in the last possible moments before dinner. She would return covered in mud and wearing a big, bright, shiny grin on her face. That's why she was only a bit annoyed when supper time came around and Wendy wasn't home. Thinking she had finally gone out farther than her normal excursion and would need a stern reprimanding, the Winthrops began to eat dinner without Wendy. It wasn't until the sun had began falling that the anger subsided and was replaced by fear in the Winthrop house. The family would stop eating dinner so that Mr. Winthrop could call for Wendy in the backyard, and Mrs. Winthrop could place an emergency call for her missing daughter. It had taken the officers 5 hours to reach the point of calling off the search for the night. The forest had grown too thick and the rain too powerful to safely continue. When they returned to the police department to prepare a plan for the following day and to request backup from state police and forest rangers, a large group of volunteers greeted them. They were all townspeople ready to help in any way they could. The officers thanked them before receiving 2 anonymous tips that had been called in while they were out. Officer Samuels had left the other officers to talk to the volunteers while he looked over the notes. One read, "Babes in the Wood," while the other simply said, "You didn't look up." Thinking it was some sort of malicious prank, he brushed them off, using them as a coaster for his coffee cup when he rejoined the larger group. It was past 2 in the morning when the officers sent everyone home. They agreed to regroup in 4 hours at the edge of the forest behind the Winthrop house. Officer Samuels was about to throw out his coffee when he rediscovered the notes he had earlier dismissed. Not wanting to leave any stone unturned, he sat down, pondering the information in front of him, before attempting to research the 2 phrases. While the officer could find nothing on the second note about looking up, the first note led him to an old 17th century folk song. The song was used to warn children about wandering off on their own. The story followed 2 children who went out into the forest, only to lose their way and wind up dead, with ravens crying over them. "Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood?" Fearing this was a taunt or a sick hint referring to what happened to the Winthrop girl, Samuels called every officer involved with the case, quickly updating and informing them of his discovery. They hit the town and began to try and find anyone who had seen anything suspicious. This proved fruitless regarding the missing girl. The only thing of note they discovered from the previous days was about a man running back and forth from the local church at odd hours, leaving the cops to only hope that the woods would hold all the answers they would need, and that Wendy had stayed safe. The following morning, 30 volunteers showed up to aid the Rangers, K-9 unit, and standard officers with the search and rescue. Breaking up into teams of 10, the men fanned out and entered the woods. Officer Samuels led his group to the point in the forest where the officers searching the previous night had to turn back. Pausing to allow the group to catch their breath, he remembered the notes from the previous day and looked up from the felled tree he had sat on. Roughly 12 feet above the ground was a shiny blue rain jacket, hanging over a branch and stained with a dark color. As Samuels radioed for backup, one of the men in the group climbed up the tree and grabbed the jacket. He brought it down, presenting it to Samuels with a solemn look on his face. As backup arrived to take the jacket back for forensic testing, the group pushed forward into the woods. They hadn't walked far when they found a second clue, this time on the ground. It was a small running shoe with the letter W written on the tag in the heel. This was then followed by a second shoe on the ground, a headband around a branch, and some scraps of cloth. The final clue was a fistful of hair stuck to the trunk of a tree by dried blood. The search party stopped just beyond the last discovery in a small clearing next to a rocky incline that separated a raised part of the forest. Most of the volunteers had begun losing hope and tiring. They chose to sit and rest, while the more experienced forest rangers took the opportunity to climb the steep hill to explore the cave. The rangers had been gone only a few minutes before the radio spoke to all emergency services. From what the rangers could gather, it was bad, and they needed to send forensics and the medical examiner. Disheartened, but not wanting to miss information, the volunteers sat in silence and shock as officers and different team members began to climb to the opening in the hill. Officer Samuels stayed on the ground, directing men and controlling the murmuring within the group of civilians. He moved from the group only once to shake hands with a Mr. Oswald. Oswald was a tall and thin man who hid his age as well as his sadness written clearly on his face. Oswald had not been an original member of the search party, and instead had arrived with the backup officers called by the rangers. He was not one for long walks in the sun, nor was he one for the forest in general. He had come with one purpose: to examine the remains in the cave above him. He climbed slowly, preparing himself to come face to face with a frozen little girl who had passed in her sleep, but was shocked when he entered. The cave was not as small as he initially thought, and easily held the 6 men who had climbed up to it. But this isn't what shocked Oswald. It wasn't the smell, or the piles of bones scattered along the walls, or the gore lying in the center of the cave. Instead, it was the copious amounts of blood everywhere. It pooled around the small pile of viscera in the ground, and was strewn across the walls in seemingly random patterns. As Oswald ventured deeper, he realized that the patterns hadn't been random at all. Instead, the blood had been smeared or painted, creating rough symbols all over the ground, walls, and ceiling. The horror of the situation momentarily left him as he became fascinated by a mark on the wall and began to approach it. It wasn't until an officer put a hand on his shoulder to redirect him that he even realized what he had done. With a renewed focus on the task at hand, he got to work. Oswald hadn't been in the cave for longer than 10 minutes when a young deputy climbed down and approached Samuels. He informed him of the state of the cave, as well as the examiner's initial diagnosis of the body. Samuels took his hat off and asked the deputy to mind the group of volunteers. Samuels then hung his head as he began back down the path they had created from the edge of the forest. Samuels knew it would take time for the forensics to determine for sure that it was Wendy in the cave. He also knew someone had to prepare to break the news to the family when it was confirmed. He had walked for a few minutes, contemplating everything he had known about the entire investigation so far, and trying to figure out how it all fit together. He was distracted when he remembered the folk tale he had researched the night before. Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood? It came to his mind in a sing-song tone that was anything but cheery. It immediately made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around slowly in fear to make sure he was alone with the trees. Despite his attempts to focus on anything but the rhyme, he couldn't stop his heart from beginning to pick up speed, the words seeming to echo through the trees and into his mind. Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood? Officer Samuels had not realized he was in the first clearing where the jacket had been found when his fear engulfed him and forced him into a light jog. He was also unaware of the situation back at the cave side, where the volunteers had been dismissed and were being led back out of the forest by the young deputy who had replaced Samuels as the group's caretaker. The group was disheartened and nervous because of the news they received by the cave. They walked in silence until one of the volunteers asked if anyone else heard the sound of static. Pausing to listen, other members of the group did, causing the deputy to turn his radio off in case it had been him causing the sound. The sound of the static didn't go away, and instead got louder as the group walked farther down the path marked by Samuels on his way out. It reached a deafening crescendo as the group entered the clearing where the jacket had been found. They paused, looking around for the source of the noise when a member of the group screamed. Following her gaze, the others looked up in shock and horror as they saw first a crackling radio in a high branch. The radio was followed by the silhouette of a man skewered on the top of a tall tree, like a macabre Christmas tree topper. Some volunteers immediately began running back towards the officers and the cave. Others made a sprint to exit the forest. The deputy stood petrified in fear, reading the name Samuels over and over again off the back of the uniformed body. The officers at the cave heard the screams and met the returning group in haste, trying to calm them all down and understand the situation. The others who had attempted to escape the forest had run in blind terror. They were so focused on their escape that they hardly noticed as members of the group tripped or became separated. Finally able to piece together a story through the sobs and gasps of the returning volunteers, the officers moved to investigate and escort all civilians out of the woods. They walked slowly with guns drawn, listening for but not hearing any of the same static that was heard by the volunteers. Instead, they heard a loud, echoing boom that came from the direction of the town. In town, chaos had erupted as the local church was engulfed in a fireball which brought the steeple crashing down into the sanctuary. Calls rang out from all across town for all emergency services, and firefighters rushed to the scene trying to extinguish the blaze and determine if anyone was hurt. Similarly, the officers in the woods were attempting to find any of the missing volunteers and to make sure none were hurt. This proved harder than they thought, as they were not only unable to find the body of Officer Samuels, but any signs of the missing people at all. They were close to walking out of the forest when they heard moaning and sobbing. Rushing over to the noise, they found a man leaning against a fallen tree. He was whiter than the bone sticking out from his leg and was murmuring incoherently. He began fading out of consciousness as they helped him up to take him out of the forest, saying a few words before hanging his head. It took them. Trees. Fearing the worst, the volunteers who had seen Officer Samuels turned and looked into the canopy. They saw that the trail they had just walked down was shaded with bodies skewered across the tops of trees. The group was petrified with fear as the wind began blowing, shaking the leaves and making shadows dance between the trunks around them. In town, the firefighters were relieved to find there had been no one in the building at the time of the fire. But relief faded quickly as they were puzzled and disturbed to find there had been drums of gasoline placed in the hall between the steeple and sanctuary. Recalling the statements taken the previous day about an individual acting suspiciously around the church, the officers set out to gather information. 2 officers had found a witness who was able to tell them information about their possible suspect. He had been seen driving a green van that had a scrape along the right side from fender to bumper. He was also seen running things in and out of the church while wearing a robe of some sort. The officers knew of only one vehicle in town which matched that description, and set off to the house of Howard E. Jones, a local artist. Jones answered the door nervously, not wanting to let officers into his home or wanting to exit the home himself. Noticing his demeanor, one of the officers attempted to peer into the crack between Jones and the door. His vision was immediately blocked as Jones placed his hand on the door frame, revealing a scabbed cut of a symbol matching the one on the detonators. The officers reacted immediately, grabbing Jones and pushing into the home, or what could loosely be called a home. As one officer fought to put cuffs on the struggling man, the other gazed around a room devoid of any indication that someone lived in it. There was no furniture and no lights except a few scattered candles and the flicker of the fireplace. They got Jones secured and sat him against the wall in his kitchen before breaking apart to search the rest of the house for any evidence of bomb-making materials. One officer found success, as the master bedroom had been littered with wires, timers, and tubs of labeled chemicals. However, the other officer found something far more disturbing and called out that he needed his partner to see what he was seeing. Down a hallway at the opposite end of the house was a room with windows blacked out. This forced the officers to use their flashlight beams to examine the room. The first thing they noticed was that some symbols covered every inch of the floor, walls, and ceiling in spiral patterns, all leading to one point. In the center of the spirals was a wall-length painting of a creature. It was white-gray with vertical slit eyes and blood-red symbols, which matched those in the room and appeared to be oozing blood, trailing from the black toothy smile down its impossibly long arms to its black claws. The officers went deeper into the room, stepping closer to the image when they heard a clatter coming from the kitchen. They rushed towards it, expecting to see Jones escaping the house, but slowed as they noticed he hadn't moved from the room. Instead, they saw a drawer that had been ripped from its rails. Howard E. Jones stood next to it, crying. He was holding a road flare above a tub from his bedroom, which had been labeled Boom. Jones swallowed hard and whispered the words, "Poor babes in the woods," before lighting the flare and bathing himself, the officers, and the entire house in a wave of liquid flames. The sirens echoed in the streets as 2 ambulances passed each other, one empty and rushing to the Jones house, the other coming from the edge of the forest. It had picked up a single man who had been leaning against a squad car, unconscious and holding a badly broken leg. The EMTs worked hard to deal with the bleeding and intubate the man with the weak pulse. They feared he had separated from the search party, injured himself, and hobbled out of the woods, only able to hit the emergency alert button on a CB radio before passing out. He was admitted to the hospital at 3 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, missing most of his tongue. He also had a right leg which needed to be amputated mid-calf, and deep scratch marks on the back of his neck and behind his knees. It would be 5 weeks before he woke up. He had missed the largest search and rescue attempt the country had ever seen, as well as the massive wake for the 45 men and women who had entered but never left the forest on that Tuesday morning, and the little girl who had gone missing the night before. Doctors and FBI agents all attempted to gain information by having the man write, but he refused, instead only drawing the same symbol over and over with increasing distress. When the clipboard had been taken from him in an attempt to calm him down, he began scratching the symbol into his thighs. He broke the skin, forcing doctors to sedate him against his protest. The final act of his life would be to scream, a vocal cord ripping scream that sounded unnatural and set everyone in the hospital on edge. As the scream faded, so did the man's consciousness, followed by his heartbeat. The doctors pronounced him dead, claiming his death had been due to cardiac arrest from an allergic reaction to the sedative they used. This was the universally accepted reason. To this day, no bodies have ever been found in that forest, and no one has been able to explain why the man was pointing out of the window and into the trees as he breathed his last breath. I would like to extend a very special thank you to author E.G.Writings for giving me permission to record his story and share it with you. I will be putting the link to his original post on Reddit in the description below. I urge you to please follow that link and go give them an upvote and leave them a comment to let them know that you enjoyed their story. If you enjoyed my video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I post every week on Tuesday and Friday. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Bye! Pretty babes in the wood, pretty babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the